UK economy needs to rebalance, and it needs to strengthen its manufacturing sector and build on its existing services sector. What it needs to rebalance away from is over-dependence on government spending, which is what it's been having in the last few years, and perhaps over-dependence on financial services, which accounted for a very large part of the economic growth in the last few years and proved vulnerable when the financial crash came. The manufacturing sector in the UK is substantial. We're about number 6 or 7 in the world. As a share of the economy, manufacturing is about the same as it is in France or in the United States. It's a lot less than in Germany, because Germany is just a very big manufacturing nation. And our manufacturing sector over the last year or so has been boosted by the fact we've had a big devaluation in the United Kingdom. Compared with the summer of 2007, sterling is down by about 25%, which you would know if you were being paid in sterling here. So that's given, because manufacturing is heavily export dependent, the manufacturing sector has been quite strong over the last 18 months or so. Well, the aiming to rebalance the economy and build up savings and not depend so heavily on debt is really driven by the fact that in the run-up to 2007, 2008, the UK economy became about the most heavily borrowed in the world, and family debt, government debt were completely out of control. No, they were unbalanced anyway. So the idea is that savings should be built up in the banking sector. The banks got over-borrowed and they didn't have enough capital. And families had balance sheets got out of kilter as well. So the idea is that savings will increase and that the economy as a whole will be less dependent on debt. And that should mean that over time economic growth will be more sustainable, less vulnerable to these big volatile swings we've seen in the last year or two. There is political consensus in the UK that we need to take urgent action to tackle climate change. And it's not an ideological matter in the UK. It hasn't actually ever been. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher talked about the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And particularly when David Cameron became head of the Conservative Party, he was very anxious to reach out to the centre ground of politics and not seem like an ideological character. So he was very big on all this from the beginning, and went up to the Arctic and had pictures of himself taken with husky dogs and things like that. And I think that squared also with the views of voters as well, that this was a matter to be taken seriously, and politicians do what voters want them to do. A lot of manufacturing factories in the UK have closed and relocated to China and other emerging economies over the last 10 or 15 years, but that's not been to do with the price for carbon. It's been that manufacturing costs in those countries just a lot lower than they are in the United Kingdom, salaries being a fraction of what they are in the UK. That's what's driven it. It hasn't been to do with carbon leakage or the carbon price. It's hard to measure whether putting a price on carbon through the European emission trading system has had any impact at all. The European Union says that fears of carbon leakage were hugely overstated, and we shouldn't get too carried away by that. It's hard to put a number around that. My guess is that actually the recession had a much bigger impact than anything to do with the carbon price on reduction in energy-intensive industries in the European Union. The government set up a target for 2050 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% and 50% by 2025. And it sort of sensibly said that there's no point in having a target and then waking up in 2040 and saying, oops, we're missing this by a mile. We've got to monitor it on the way through and make sure we're on a trajectory that will reach the goal we're aiming for. So in 2008, there was a Climate Change Act, and they set up an independent committee on climate change made up of technocrats, basically, people who understand all this stuff, and charged them with setting carbon budgets over 5-year periods from now to 2050, and saying where we needed to get to as a country in terms of emissions over those different budget periods. And they they were tasked with looking 3 budgets forward, so they're now into the mid-2020s. And the idea is that they will say what needs to be done to get there, and government's job is to set the policies to arrive at those budgets going forward. And this is legislated, this is statutory, it's not kind of the whim of a politician. So it's quite serious stuff. The UK's energy future is a critical issue for business right now. Between now and 2020, we're going to have to replace about a quarter of our power generating capacity And actually beyond 2020, there's a lot more to be replaced as well. And that's because our nuclear power plants, which are about 20% of our electricity supplies, are approaching obsolescence and will have to be replaced. And we still have a fair amount of dirty coal. So there's a huge investment needed in the UK's energy sector, £110 billion between now and 2020. The government has agreed, Parliament has agreed that we should rebuild our nuclear fleet, and that's beginning to happen. The government is also determined to get a great deal of offshore wind into the energy mix going forward. And so we're going to see a huge investment in, especially on the eastern coastline of the United Kingdom, in offshore wind arrays. And there's also the beginnings of investment in technology development for carbon capture and storage, so we can clean up our coal system. So there's and of course gas for the United Kingdom is and will remain a very, very important part of our energy mix. So there's a lot going on, and obviously the goal, the objective, is to end up in 10 or 20 years' time with a diverse supply of low-cost, low-carbon energy, or price-competitive energy, as we put it that way. The Green Investment Bank, which the UK government is setting up, it's really early days, and it's starting off in quite a modest way. I think they've put aside £3 billion of capital for the thing, and they've said you may not borrow you Green Investment Bank, and I think it's 2050, because they don't want public debt to rise at a time when the government is desperately trying to get public debt down. I think the idea is that it, among other things, that it should be an infrastructure bank that will help the UK in this big challenge of rebuilding its power generating capacity. That there's a lot of political risk in building, I don't know, a wind array, because you don't know quite whether policies might change and whether subsidies will continue and all that stuff. So the cost of capital is high in building low carbon energy. And the idea should be that the Green Investment Bank, which is government backed, will contribute to reducing the cost of capital and make it quicker and easier to build this stuff, which we desperately need. That's its main mission. I'm hesitant to say what lessons New Zealand businesses should learn from UK businesses, because it's a very different economy, and New Zealand has got its own ideas and its own opportunities. I suppose what we both have to understand is that this is not a zero-sum game where a win for the environment is a loss for business. I think that the exciting thing about all this is that a shift to a low-carbon economy will create new products and new services that don't exist now, and companies that get ahead of the curve will be in a strong position to prosper. Well, I think New Zealand has some, as a kind of brand, has really formidable assets. First of all, it's, you know, the public perception is of a country with fantastic countryside, with a lot of food production of the most high quality kind. I mean, grass-fed cattle and all those good things, and wonderful and enormous fishery stocks. It has a very high proportion of its energy coming from renewables, and it has technology in geothermal that it's developing that I think the rest of the world will find very interesting and attractive. It has assets in areas like water management and forestry management that will be relevant to the rest of the world. So my feeling is that in this changing world, New Zealand has some really strong cards to play. The Kiwis think of themselves as being good at innovation, but not at commercialising, and Brits think the same way about themselves as well. The Brits are always saying, we have brilliant scientists, how come we're not better at turning it into dollars and cents, and why do we have to go to the United States for all that stuff to happen? I think two or three things. One is that we've seen in the UK that the universities are great hubs for new business clusters. So if you go to places like Cambridge or Manchester or Dundee or Warwick, you'll see around the universities new firms starting up and employing people and doing clever and exciting things. And there's a little bit of government money to help that, which I think is important. So those clusters help. I think that one thing that the UK has, which the New Zealand is less equipped with, is it has a big capital market, so there is money there to support innovations and new technologies in a way that is harder to do here. So you just have to be cleverer and harder nosed about it all. And as far as I can see, you are, so that's fine.